So it's officially February 1st, and game passes, specifically the multipliers, are still working, and a lot of players are very confused about what's happening with the Royale High economy. And Royale High actually released an official statement this morning about an upcoming poll they're going to be releasing into the game that has to do with the prizes that will be awarded to Game Pass owners. Now, obviously, we have a lot to talk about, and there is a lot of confusion in the community right now, so I'm going to do my absolute best to clear up any misconceptions, because I do think, although there is maybe some communication lacking for specific sections, this stuff has been stated, maybe just not super openly. So I did take some time this morning to look and go ahead and find information that I can share with you guys regarding the release date and potential update date for the economy system rework in Royale High. Now, basically, yesterday I made a video talking about how Royale High is kind of subtly teasing that one of the prizes for the Game Pass owners, once the Game Passes are removed, may be a Halo. And part of that was actually released this morning in part of a statement by Royale High. And they write, "Hi students, we want to let you know that we'll be releasing an in-game poll soon available only to Game Pass holders, where you can vote on whether the reward items should be tradable or not. We've heard your request to be more involved in decisions like this, and we're excited to give you a voice." Which 100% kudos to them. I do feel like, and something I have criticized Royale High for in the past, is that I feel like a lot of the times changes are made with the assumption that players shouldn't have a voice in any changes and that their opinions don't matter. And whether or not that's the intention or not, I don't think so. Like, I don't think their intention is to make players feel dismissed, but that's what it feels like when you make these really drastic changes to the economy or the game system without getting any player input before, announcing these changes and basically just telling players, hey, you have to deal with it. So I really do like that they are actually allowing players to give their voice and opinions on this update. I did talk about this actually yesterday in my video. Specifically, if one of the prizes were to be a Halo, that I personally do not believe it should be tradable. Now, we're going to go over lots of people's different opinions when it comes to this, but something that I saw people commenting that I guess maybe they didn't watch that part of my video was that people were saying that if there was a Halo, it wouldn't be worth anything because so many people would have the Halo because so many people own the Game Passes. In theory, yes, that makes sense, but I think something that's also important to note is that a lot of people who purchase Game Passes in Royale High actually no longer play the game. Now, if you guys know anything about Royale High, especially when it comes to player counts, there is obviously a ton of evidence to support this, that the player counts have kind of been diminishing year over year, and that's not necessarily because Royale High is dying per se, because, consumer trends are shifting. During COVID, there was obviously going to be a massive influx of players playing Royale High just because they had nothing else to do, everybody was home, and all games on Roblox actually saw an influx of player base when it came to COVID-19 times. And then after that, as people started returning to real life, those player counts kind of returned to normal. And I think that's also important to note is that Royale High was notoriously a game that was, I would say, in its peak back in 2020 or 2019, and that's when a lot of players were kids. And a lot of these players that used to play in 2019 have now grown up, maybe they're in high school, they're in university, and so they've aged out of the game. So now Royale High is trying to attract new players who still play the game. Now, don't get me wrong, of course there's adults that play Royale High, but I do think it's important to note that obviously players, their interests will shift as they grow, and so part of that does mean that players who previously purchased Game Passes may no longer play the game or may no longer have any interest in the game. So I think to say that every single player who ever purchased a Game Pass will be playing Royale High and have a Halo, and that's why the Halos will be worthless, I don't think is an accurate thing to say, primarily because a lot of the players who purchased Game Passes over the past several years either got banned on Roblox, probably don't play Royale High anymore, or just don't play Roblox as a whole anymore, right? You have to understand that not every single person who ever purchased a Game Pass will be logging into Royale High on the day that these items are released, and although there will still be a ton of stock of these items because there is a ton of, current players who own Game Passes, I do think that the numbers of Game Pass holders does not correlate to the actual amount of Halos that will be in circulation if the item is tradable. Just because, again, not every single person who ever purchased Game Passes still even plays Royale High. Now, something I did want to talk about was a lot of players were very concerned this morning when they logged into Royale High and they saw that the multipliers were still working. And I do feel like there is a need for clarification here, which I do think maybe could have been further clarified by Royale High, because what I saw a lot of players tweeting specifically on Twitter yesterday was that they were so excited for the economy rework today, and it was kind of implied that next month, i.e. February, there would be an economy rework, and I do still believe that's in the works, but something that's important to note is that in their official statement that was released on January 16th, where they talked about the economy rework, they emphasized in that statement at the bottom that these changes would take effect a month after the announcement went live. And I think a lot of people assume that that just meant next month, so February 1st. However, if you look, you can see that players were actually able to purchase a 1-month subscription to the multipliers up until January 15th, I believe. And so up until January 15th, people were still purchasing subscriptions, maybe January 16th, depending on your time zone. But basically what that means is that they obviously own the right to use Game Passes or the multipliers for a full month because they paid for that full month time frame, right? And so basically, Royale High has to allow them to finish out their subscription, which most players' subscriptions will run out on January 15th or 16th if they purchase them on the February 15th or 16th if they purchase them on January 15th or 16th. So that basically means that Royale High still technically has 2 full weeks to do the economy rework and do some updates with the game before they actually release the Game Pass, prizes. And so I understand that players may be a little bit confused because they felt like there's some miscommunication or there's a lack of clarity there. So I did just want to clear that up because I do feel like, myself included, I was a little bit confused when I logged in this morning, and so I still have my multipliers, and that's why I went back to the original tweet to see, oh, they said a month from the post being posted was when the economy rework was going to happen, because they had to let all of these stuff, obviously the subscriptions, finish out, otherwise they'd be scamming players because they weren't able to finish their subscriptions. So that is an important thing to note. Now, with that in mind, this is further, supported by the fact that the diamond costs in the shop have not changed, and I'm also still getting 1,800 diamonds per level, whereas some players are only getting 300. So that is an important factor to note, that the economy rework will not be coming out until about halfway through February, to my understanding. Now, with that in mind, based on the post that they put up this morning about the poll, there was a lot of community feedback that has to do with the Everfriend set and just players' feedback on whether or not they think the items should be tradable. And so I want to go over that with you guys, obviously, because I thought some players had some really good points here. Now, I always have to clarify this for some reason, but if you post something publicly online, and it is on a public account, on a public platform, and I use it in my video, it's considered fair use. So I'm allowed to use it. That's how fair use works. If you post something publicly, there's no expectation of privacy, so please keep that in mind. But somebody commented asking Royale High what happened to the Everfriend set, and Royale High responded saying, it definitely hasn't been forgotten. I'm asking about it every day for you all. The latest update I received today is that it's still being formatted. Going forward, we won't be teasing items that aren't fully finished yet. While we didn't share an official release date, we definitely underestimated how excited and eager the community would be, and we truly appreciate your patience and enthusiasm. Now, this to me kind of seems like it's a little bit lacking an apology here, which I'm not going to necessarily ask for an apology from them, but it kind of seems like the generic response they typically give when there is an issue is that they re-clarified that although they didn't give like a specific release date, it was heavily hinted, and I think it was implied indirectly, and players were under the assumption that when the picture was finished, the set would be released. So I think you can't really blame players for not understanding that the set wasn't going to be released when the final image came out and saying, oh, we didn't give an official release date. Well, that's not an excuse for maybe unintentionally misleading players. Like, at the end of the day, that's what that whole image reveal thing was doing. Players were under the assumption that when the last image was released, the set would be dropping, and because you guys were releasing an image every single day, they were under the assumption the set would be releasing a couple days later, which has now been several weeks, so I can understand players' frustration, but I definitely do appreciate that they are acknowledging that, hey, in the future, let's not do sneak peeks until stuff is fully finished, just so players don't get the wrong idea, which I do think is obviously a good thing to acknowledge here. Now, when it comes to the comments underneath the post, this person, which the post I'm referring to is the one where they basically talk about whether or not the items will be tradable. And this person writes, guys, do yes so we can profit, which obviously I can understand this person's perspective. And I think a lot of people obviously do want to profit from items like this, but I think at the same time, I don't know how profitable the Halo would be considering how many people will have access to it. Yes, it won't be absolutely every single person who ever bought a multiplier ever, but at the same time, if they were to release a Halo, I feel like with so many people getting it at once, the Halo would be worth significantly less to start out with, because if you ever realize like how Halo values work with like new seasons and stuff like that in Royale High, when a new Halo comes to the fountain, the first couple people to kind of win the Halo, they basically dictate the value of the Halo because they go to Tradery, they trade it for obnoxiously high amounts, right? And then as more people get access to the Halo by winning it, the Halo's value actually goes down. You can see this trend with every single fountain Halo ever, is that when the Halo comes out, it's very highly priced and then it slopes down, and sometimes it will shoot back up depending on how much players like the Halo, but typically it kind of finds like a middle ground where it just kind of stagnates and then stays at that value roughly for the rest of its lifetime, right? Now, I do think it's important to note that when this Halo, if that was one of the prizes, were to be released, because it'll be released all in one big batch at the same time, I do believe that the value for the Halo would start out pretty low, so I wouldn't necessarily think that you're going to get a profit from it, but you never know. Now, this person by the name of Raven says, I'm voting no. We spend money on the game passes, so I think the items should be special and staying that person who owns the game passes. It'd be different if it was something earned or won, meaning it's free, but in this case, it's not. Which I also think something important to note is that although Royale High says you can't have alternate accounts, spam accounts, backup accounts, whatever you call it, right? There's obviously a ton of players that have those, and a ton of players specifically bought accounts, which you guys have probably noticed in Royale High, accounts that falsely pretend to be players. They will only purchase the 2 multiplier game passes and then will farm using like random scripts for hours upon hours upon hours, and then sell those diamonds on third-party websites. Those accounts will then, which typically they have several accounts, like these sellers have like tens of accounts, like tons of accounts, and they will basically get a ton of Halos at once, which I guess they would then, if the items are tradable, my concern would be that they would then go and try and sell those Halos on third-party applications like Facebook Marketplace, Etsy, Fiverr, etc., which in my opinion could, pose a risk for players getting scammed, because a lot of players obviously would want the rewards for the game passes if they are tradable. So I do think that would open up the opportunity for a lot of players to be scammed and unfortunately taken advantage of, which I don't think would be a good thing. So personally, my opinion is that items shouldn't be tradable, but that's just my 2 cents. Now, this other player by the name of Izzy says, I really feel like it should be tradable. Players who want to keep it as a trophy still can, but those who'd rather trade it and are being forced to keep either something they don't want to keep something they don't want, making it non-tradable just takes away options. It feels a bit unfair in my opinion, which I respect Izzy's opinion. I do think this is a valid concern, and I understand there's both like 2 sides to the issue. I'm just, in my opinion, trying to weigh like the lesser of 2 evils, if that makes sense, which there isn't really an evil in this situation, but like the one that I feel like poses lesser of a risk to the community. However, I do understand Izzy's point, where it is, obviously if, a Halo was potentially a item or a prize that players would get for owning the multiplier, maybe not everybody would want a Halo and they want to trade it, they want to get a different item that they want. And, I definitely do think that before this poll opens, I would personally like to know what the items are that we're voting on, because I feel like if you don't release what the potential prizes are, it kind of creates this like false, I would say, like understanding from players, which I think would then cause more frustration if the item's released and it's not what players thought it would be. And so I do think, out of transparency's sake, if you're asking for players' honest opinions about whether an item should be tradable or not, I do think it's crucial that players understand what item they're voting for to be tradable or not, so they can make an informed decision. Because I understand they want it to be secret, but not sharing what the item is, I think would really skew the way that players would decide whether or not they want to trade the item, and would lead to, inaccurate results in the polling system. But regardless, that is obviously just my thought, but I'd like to know what you guys think about that, and if you think that would also be an issue. Now, this person writes, I personally think it shouldn't be tradable. I see some people saying it should be because they don't, what if they don't like the item? But if so many people already have the game passes, it's not going to be as valuable. Also, if you don't like the item, don't use it, not to be rude. Which I think this is also a valid point. At the end of the day, you're not going to like every single item in the game. But I do think part of this comes from it's a tricky kind of situation, because everybody paid the same price to get the game pass. And so to say just don't use it, I think is a valid point to make, but at the same time, players did spend their hard-earned money on something. It'd be different if it was a replacement for a free item, but the fact that it's a paid item, I do think that obviously players should have a right to be able to use the item, whether, just because they did spend money on it. So I think it would depend on how many toggles are on the items, because if the item has tons of toggles, I think that'd be a different story, because then I think everybody could find a use for the item, but you never know. Now, this person by the name of Claire Bear says, I thought y'all were going to give us surprises since it's February and the game passes are gone. When will we get them? Which, clarification, the game passes are currently still active. You just can't purchase them. Because players could purchase subscriptions up until January 15th or 16th, depending on your time zone, those subscriptions they last for a month. So the month doesn't end until about February 15th to 16th, depending on when players again bought them. So obviously, Royale High can't take out the multipliers before those players' game passes expire or subscriptions expire. So they have to wait until those, finish. So I do not believe that the multipliers will be removed until February 15th, 16th, so after Valentine's Day. But again, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a developer, but based on what Royale High has put out, that is the conclusion that I've come to. Now, on top of that, this person writes, actually at Royale High Vlogs, do we have any sort of idea on when when we get our rewards for the game passes, like in a week or around halfway in the month? It's because I barely get to play due to school. And again, I'm pretty sure it's going to be about halfway through the month based on the information that I've collected, based on what the Royale High Vlogs has posted on Twitter. Now, this person says, it depends on what we are getting, because I really want to know what we are voting for. If you get me, I'm hoping we somehow get to see the items before voting on whether or not it should be tradable or not, which again, I think it's a very valid point. You need to know what you're voting for before you can vote for it, you know what I mean? Now, this person, which do I see an Ever After High profile picture? That's so cute. They say, those who bought the passes are still getting double. I didn't have it and I'm still getting less, and it takes me forever to level up, and the only reward with me with 300 diamonds. Imagine those who didn't have the passes too, 300 diamonds every hour. It seems like a joke. Which I do want to clarify again. I think players are under the impression that the multipliers are going to end February 1st, and I was also under that impression before I reread the original post. And so I do feel like some additional clarification from Royale High would have been really helpful in this situation, just because although they didn't share any sort of information that'd be ending on the February 1st, it was kind of implied, and that's what players understood, because as more people regurgitate the same message, sometimes details get lost in communication, which isn't Royale High's fault, but I do feel like just a little message saying, hey guys, just so you know, the update's going to be coming out about on the 15th, 16th, whatever, right? would help a lot of players, avoid the misinformation that has been circulating specifically on Twitter, and I think would clear up a lot of communication issues, but that's obviously just my opinion. And finally, we have this message from Noi, I think is how I say that, and they say they should not be tradable. Past items are not tradable, like Crystal Ball or the Fabric Skirt. It's the same idea for new items. If you don't buy them, you don't have profit traders, I think that's what they meant to say, going to make it very high and won't solve the inflation problem, which is one of my concerns, especially with the amount of people that own game passes. Again, not all of them still play Royale High, but at the same time, there are a lot of accounts that farm using basically spam accounts and use like auto clickers and stuff like that. And so I would be concerned how many of those accounts will get access to the halos and how they may manipulate the price of the halos through false trading, history, stuff like that. So regardless, I do think this is obviously a pretty complex issue. However, I do want to clarify that my understanding is that these changes will not go into effect until about halfway through February, and that personally I would really like to see the items we're voting on in the poll before we vote on them, because I feel like that's part of making an informed decision, but of course it's just my opinion. So let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think about this? Of course, I'm super thankful that Royale High is, taking community feedback into consideration, because I do think that's a really important thing to do, especially when your game really, relies on your player base to keep it afloat. But regardless, let me know your thoughts down below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye!